This podcast is brought to you by Casa de la Zisa.
Welcome back for another episode of the AI Analysis Podcast. Today we're getting musical. We're looking at an episode of the podcast, Classical Musica with Dr. Peter Zisa.
Yeah, we've been listening to Dr. Zisa's conversation with classical guitarist Dragos Ilie. It's over on the Pantheon Podcast YouTube channel.
Right, and I think what struck me immediately was how this conversation kind of transcended just the classical guitar.
Yeah.
It explored this musician's personal evolution, like what drives him, and some really insightful observations on learning and performing music.
Yeah.
And I think it really speaks to anyone, who's fascinated by like the pursuit of a passion.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether you're picking up an instrument for the first time or trying to master a new skill, there's a lot here that will resonate.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting the notes right. It's about the commitment, the challenges, and the meaning behind it all.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Dragos Ilie, right?
Yeah.
Starts by recounting how he got into guitar back in Romania. And it wasn't this meticulously planned beginning.
No, it started very organically with his father, who wasn't a professional musician, but he enjoyed playing at home.
Right.
And then Dragos even mentioned a ukulele around age 4, which probably served more as a toy at that point.
Right, exactly. But then the real turning point, it came around his 8th birthday with this 1-month challenge his dad gave him.
Right.
An hour of guitar practice every day, no giving up. I think that's a pretty good parenting strategy, isn't it?
It is.
Like that early commitment, even if it's short term, it kind of gets you past that initial hurdle, right?
Yeah.
And can really foster that passion.
I think his father anticipated that there'd be like sore fingertips and moments of frustration.
Yeah.
And he knew that having a finite short-term commitment would help him push through that.
Yeah.
And Dragos said after that month, he never wanted to stop.
Right. And then there's a choice of classical guitar. How did that come about?
It's kind of a funny story, actually. When they went to buy his next guitar, there was an acoustic model and one with nylon strings. They didn't know the difference. And it was a shopkeeper who said the nylon one had a sweeter sound. So Dragos' father was convinced, just like that. A random comment, subjective opinion, charted his whole musical course.
Yeah, and that sweeter sound often refers to a warmer tone as opposed to the bright sound of steel strings.
Yeah.
Which are more common in other genres.
Exactly, yeah.
So talk about a pivotal moment hinging on a simple suggestion. He also mentioned the period of learning by ear early on.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Well, learning by ear definitely contributed to his really good ear, his ability to recognize and reproduce sounds. But as he pointed out, it also ingrained some not-so-good habits
Right, of course.
in his technique that he later had to correct. So it's interesting, right? You have that initial exploration, which is good, but you also have that potential for ingraining bad habits.
Yeah,
It's a trade-off.
it is. So then when did his formal education in classical guitar actually begin?
So in Romania at that time, formal instruction didn't really begin until the 5th grade. So for a while, his learning was guided by his dad and his own ear. But when he finally began formal lessons in 5th grade at the College of Music in Iași, his teacher, Marius Simpo, became really important for him.
Okay, yeah.
Dragos actually described him as being his mentor for like 7, 8 years. And the power of a good mentor, you can't overstate it. They don't just teach you, they inspire you. They show you what's possible.
Right. So that early groundwork, both the informal and the formal, really set the stage.
Yeah.
But then he had to rectify those deeply ingrained habits, and that had to be a challenge, right?
Oh, for sure. He said those first couple years of formal lessons were mostly dedicated to correcting those technical errors. And it's pretty common for musicians who start without instruction. Relearning something can be harder than learning it right the first time.
Yeah, it's much harder to break a habit than to learn something new sometimes.
Absolutely.
He also later on reflects on his time as a teacher assistant at the University of Austin, and he interacted with these guitarists from non-classical backgrounds. What did he learn from that?
It gave him this really interesting perspective, He saw how guitarists from other genres held their instruments and used their hands differently. And when students would say a certain way felt more natural, he would kind of challenge them on that feeling.
It's interesting, right? Because so much of it is ingrained habit.
It is. It is.
And his method of explaining technique, it wasn't just do this because I'm telling you to.
Yeah, he really focused on the why behind classical technique, like the human anatomy and mechanics. He'd have students compare hand positions, showing how wrist alignment, for example, actually helps with speed and dexterity.
It makes sense.
By explaining the inherent advantages, he helps students have these aha moments, where they really got it. So that really highlights the importance of understanding the principles behind a skill, beyond just the steps.
Yeah, if you understand the reasoning behind a method, you're more likely to stick with it.
For sure, yeah. And he even admitted that as a young student, if the teacher didn't explain the why, he was less likely to listen.
Of course.
So it's about showing a better way, not just the right way.
Yeah. So we talked about the role of mentors and role models. His fifth-grade teacher was really important, but what other influences were there?
Going to guitar festivals had a huge impact on him. He described it as like leveling up. Just being around all these great artists and enthusiasts was super motivating for him.
So these festivals weren't just about competing.
No, not at all. He even told this story about his first guitar festival. It made him want to buy a guitar case more than the bicycle he'd been saving up for. He saw those top performers and it totally changed his perspective.
So inspiring, right?
It is.
Okay, so let's talk about practice. Dragos mentioned he had to learn how to learn. What do you mean by that?
It's interesting. He realized that putting in the hours wasn't enough.
Hmm.
He needed good practice habits, so he started learning from friends, people who were really determined, even those who were better than him. He really emphasized understanding what makes practice productive. So I think that's the question for everyone listening too, right?
Yeah.
Are you just putting in the time, or are you making your practice really count?
Right. Are you practicing or are you just playing?
Exactly, yeah.
You even had that funny analogy about eating a banana before performing.
Oh, yeah. He learned from a doctor friend that the best time to eat a banana to deal with nerves is about an hour and a half before.
Huh.
It just shows how much attention he pays to detail.
It's the little things, right?
It is.
That can make all the difference. And it ties into that advice from his father about breaking down complex tasks into smaller steps.
That's right, even though his father wasn't a musician. His advice about dividing a big piece into smaller sections is so helpful. You get a sense of accomplishment as you go. It keeps you motivated. It applies to anything, really, not just music.
Absolutely. And it really struck me how many parallels there are between learning music and learning anything.
Yes.
Overcoming setbacks, perseverance, attention to detail, those were recurring themes.
He really emphasized that mistakes are part of the process. They're not something to be afraid of. You can't improve without making mistakes.
Makes sense.
And he talked about the skills music teaches you, like making choices, being organized.
Yeah.
He said a lot of his classmates ended up in challenging fields like medicine and law.
Interesting.
So the discipline and mindset from music clearly applies elsewhere.
Wow. So music really does give you skills that can translate into other areas.
It does, yeah.
CDZ Classica Musica is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It is a kind of school of music, a concert series, and an agency that promotes the musicians, dedicated artists, and educators who we feature as our performers. The goal of the Collegium is to bring community together through music performance. These performances vary in musical style from classical to jazz, and music from different parts of the world, from India to the Middle East, that'd be like Persia, and Japan, and China. The goal is to also educate us to how music functions not so much as a musical universal language, because there are differences in the way that these languages of music are expressed, but to educate us to be able to be more appreciative not only of the music but the culture it represents. And by doing this, it brings community together.
What about competitions? What did you think of those?
He saw them as a motivator, something to aim for.
Hmm.
And, of course, a chance to meet other musicians. He really encouraged young musicians to make friends at competitions, not just focus on winning.
That's a good point. It shouldn't be all about winning or losing.
Hmm.
And his attitude towards both winning and losing was actually really balanced.
Oh, for sure. He's stressed not letting those outcomes define you.
Right.
You know, music is subjective, and judging can be influenced by personal taste.
That's very true.
He also talked about how he shifted from seeking external validation to being more self-critical.
Oh, yeah.
He got to a point where even winning didn't satisfy him anymore. He was so critical of himself.
Wow, it can be a double-edged sword.
It can, so finding that balance is key.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dive into the expressive nature of music and its cultural context.
All right.
This part of the conversation was really fascinating.
It was. He emphasized that music doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's tied to its history and culture. To really understand and express a piece, he believes you need some historical context. You have to understand the unwritten rules of that time period, how art was created and received.
And he said something really interesting about music that we consider old actually being the coolest and newest music of its time.
Yeah, it's true. Our role as musicians, he argued, is to understand what excited people about that music, what drove them to create it.
I like that perspective.
Whether it's Renaissance lute music, Romanian folk music, Japanese music, understanding the culture behind it all really shapes your interpretation.
Yeah, and this exposure to different traditions, it's not just about music, is it?
Not at all, he said. He believes engaging with music from different cultures fosters respect and understanding.
Absolutely.
It broadens your perspective.
For sure. And then we have the question of connecting with the audience. How does he think about that?
Well, he sees the performer as a bridge, especially for classical music, which can be unfamiliar to some.
Yeah.
He finds that sharing the stories and context behind a piece makes more of an impact than just listing names and dates. It helps the audience connect to the music.
Right. Otherwise, it's just notes. It needs context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he emphasized being a servant of the music. You know, it's about the piece itself, not showing off your skills.
Putting the music first.
Yeah. And ideally, the audience feels like they're right there on stage with you.
That's the goal. Now, about the journey of musical mastery, it never really ends, does it?
It's a lifelong process. He talked about constantly learning, seeking out the best performers. He even quoted Roland Dyens, who distinguished between technically gifted guitarists and true poets of the instrument.
Yeah, there's a difference.
Definitely. And he talked about that feeling of leveling up, you know, after seeing someone truly amazing.
I know that feeling.
It's inspiring. It makes you want to push yourself further.
So you're constantly learning, always striving to improve.
And it's not just about practicing alone. It's about being part of the musical community.
Right.
Going to festivals, connecting with people, learning from your peers, even your rivals. It's about making the music your own while respecting the tradition.
Finding your voice.
Yeah, he even talked about cultures where instruments are primarily for personal enjoyment, not performance.
Interesting. So it's not always about sharing it.
It's about the joy of making music.
Dr. Zisa also touched on Dragos Ilie's current career.
Yeah, he's finished his doctorate, he's been teaching, and he has a contract coming up with NextOS.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It is. It's a major label. So clearly, his journey is one of passion, dedication, and understanding.
Okay, so let's recap. We heard about the importance of that initial spark, of dedicated practice, of having good mentors, and being part of a community.
And how important it is to connect the music to its context, you know, to history, culture, and the audience's experience.
Right, so it's more than just notes on a page.
Exactly.
So for everyone listening, think about how these ideas apply to your own life, your own passions. What are you dedicated to? Who are your mentors? Who are you learning from?
It's about that constant learning, that connection, that drive to get better.
If you want to hear more of these insightful conversations about classical music, we highly recommend checking out the Classical Musica with Dr. Peter Zisa's podcast on YouTube.
Yeah, and if you're enjoying these deep dives where we unpack big ideas, please subscribe to the AI Analysis podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
And we'll leave you with this thought. Think about how understanding the why behind something can deepen your appreciation for it and help you learn faster. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.